Solomon says something that's very similar to Jesus. Don't speak in the hearing of a fool. Jesus said, don't cast pearls before swine. But my question is, how do we spot a fool?
It's not an absolutized principle, because we do see examples of even Lady Wisdom projecting before a fool. The principle in there as a truism is don't waste words on unreceptive people.
Welcome back to Footnotes with Dr. Tony Caffey. I'm your host, Adam Castellino, and with me as always, of course, Pastor Tony. Good to see you.
Hey, Adam. Let's talk Proverbs, huh?
Yeah, so as you explained, this Sunday, we're transitioning into a new section.
Yeah, Collection 3.
Wow, already on Collection 3. And you had talked about, there's 30 sayings that right now we're looking at. Mm-hmm. We looked at 11 of them this week. And you mentioned Jonathan Edwards' resolutions. And I noticed this is the second time you brought that up since teaching. So you really love what he did?
Well, I am a pastor, so pastors repeat themselves without even knowing it, Adam. So, love Jonathan Edwards, one of the greatest minds that America ever produced, Christian or otherwise, a great theologian. But yeah, I've always been amazed by, Jonathan Edwards, 19 years old, putting together these lifelong resolutions that, I think some of us might look at it and say, that's so legalistic. Okay, well, he's not saying these things saved his soul.
Yeah.
As a believer, as somebody following Christ, he's like, I want to live my life this way and be committed to these things. And wouldn't you know, there's some corollaries with what Jonathan Edwards committed to with what we see in the Book of Proverbs, with even what we see in the Old Testament law, which isn't, a dirty thing. We're not anti-law as Christians. We're not antinomians. But law in the right place, resolutions in the right place. And what we have here with these 30 sayings, these 30 resolutions as well, in their proper place can be a real blessing for our lives and can help us to honor Christ as Christians. So that's the way I want to approach this. To be honest, that's kind of how I approach Proverbs all along the way. Is we're not obeying these Proverbs in order to get saved, but because we are saved.
Yeah, I've always kind of felt that way about the Proverbs, especially. Like, we know Christ has saved us. We know we're not doing anything to try to muster up his favor. But now that we are made into children of God, we're righteous through Christ and faith. This is the calling, like that high calling. Now that I am a child of God, this is how I'm to live. And this wisdom, this righteousness is the goal. Like resolution's a good term for that. I'm not going to always hit that goal, but that's my focus. It's my back to the world, to the old life. This is what I'm shooting for. And I think that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, this word in verse 18 for pleasant, it will be pleasant if you keep them basically within your belly, within your soul, the deepest part of your being. There's a common grace way that could be applied even to an unbeliever, that if you abide by these principles, your life will be, let's say, less complicated. If you live a life of integrity, if you live a life that honors people, that's, shrewd in the way that you deal with money, that's going to be better. It's going to be pleasant to your soul. And how much more is that the case if we have Christ who has redeemed us, saved our soul, we're living in obedience to him. Now that pleasantness gets supercharged, if you want to say it that way, by the fact that we're obeying as a child of God. You said it. And so that's how, Proverbs, there's so much good stuff here that just on a practical level, you're like, yes, this is how life should be lived from somebody who fears the Lord. And, there's goodness that's accessible inside and outside of the Christian community. So I want to advocate for this as general principles for life, as Solomon wrote it, but also as something that really supercharges the Christian life as well and helps us to enjoy the goodness of God's gifts in a better way.
Yeah. So in your first point, you said always be attentive to wisdom. And you made this really interesting comment of how some of what Solomon said is influenced by like the ancient Near East wisdom that was out there.
Yep.
And you kind of made a connection with Egypt. And then you said it here, you said there's this common grace wisdom. So for people who might be new to that idea, they might be shocked, like, wait a minute, there's people who didn't know Yahweh, but they were wise? How is that possible?
Yes. Okay. I'm going to go on a rant here.
Okay.
I don't know if I want to call it a rant, but I'm gonna become Dr. Caffey for about, I don't know, 5 minutes
Cool.
and walk people through this because this is really important. So at the beginning of the 20th century, these sayings of Amenemope, this Egyptian sage, were found. And Amenemope lived around the time of Solomon, actually a little bit before that. And so even before that, we knew that there were different kinds of sayings that circulated in the ancient Near East, and sometimes they would drop into the Bible, and you would see the corollaries. And so we're trying to make sense of this, like how does, the Bible incorporate some of the common grace, wisdom, or common ideas of the culture? How do we understand that in light of 2 Timothy 3:16? And the nature of theopneustos. And I think the best way to understand it is that Solomon was a highly cultured individual. So he had interaction with Egyptians. He married an Egyptian bride. He was very well read. He collected sayings, wrote his own sayings, and basically imbibed his culture just like you and I would if both of us had public school education. So we learned about economics. We learned about government. We learned about, science and mathematics and those kinds of things. And so there's a general knowledge base that we have with the rest of the world. And yet at the same time, we are Christians and we have the scriptures, which we see as authoritative, which is different from some of that wisdom. But it's not like totally antithetical in every way. There are ways in which the truth of mathematics and the scientific world and history and those things, they intersect with the Bible, and you don't have to create this bifurcation where it's like it's all the Bible and nothing else. That all truth is God's truth is the way that historically it's been understood. So Solomon, being influenced by some of these other ideas, Amenemope, maybe some other Egyptian sages. There's been connections found between Proverbs and Sumerian literature, Akkadian literature, Babylonian literature. He was knowledgeable, and so he's taking all of this in as somebody who is, incredibly intelligent, probably the most intelligent person who ever lived, and he's filtering that through his own, God-fearing mindset. And on top of that, the Holy Spirit is inspiring him to write. So he's writing with all of these things filtered, what we call theopneustos, God-breathed scripture.
Yeah.
And so even as he's writing it, he says in that first verse, pay attention to the words of the wise. That's a plural word, the wise ones, you could say. And then he says, and apply your heart to my knowledge. In other words, I'm taking these ideas that are out there that are in the ether of his space and his world. He's processing, he's writing them inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so some people look at that and they say, oh, well, he's just plagiarizing Amenemope. No, he's not. They're both understanding ideas in their own world. And yes, there's corollaries, but this is coming through Solomon to us, written in the Word.
Yeah.
And so, in the beginning of the 20th century, we found these connections between Amenemope. There's other connections out there, and whatever this is, there's just a milieu. There's a understanding of ideas that have corollaries, and so that's how we should see it. Versus, Solomon's plagiarizing or Solomon's just borrowing these ideas from another person. No, he's taking them, he's processing them through his own understanding. He's writing them, and that's how collection 3, more so than the other 2 collections, is framed. There's even a corollary in Amenemope at the end of his writing where he has 30 chapters. And Solomon here has 30 sayings. So people are saying, well, those 30 chapters are the same as the 30 sayings. If you just go and read Amenemope, they're not the same. They're different. Yeah. And yet 30 is kind of a word that's a number that's used for a kind of completion and bringing together sayings in a way that would be fulsome. And so I think that might correlate, but the writings themselves don't correlate as tightly as some people think. So how's that? Was that helpful understanding some of those things? I could probably go into more detail there, but there's some information in my manuscript online if you want even some more detail from some of the commentaries.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating, and it's kind of a use of wisdom that we may not always consider because we understand Scripture is God's written word, and we don't deviate from it. And so Christians might be tempted to kind of discredit, like you said, common grace wisdom that's out there in the world. Historically, that wasn't the case. Like I think of earlier generations of Christians, they understood this classical education where they look at Plato and they look at these Greek philosophers, and they knew they weren't believers, but there was wisdom to be found in Western thinking, like C.S. Lewis talked about. He actually wrote, I think, a translation of a Greek myth and equated it to the gospel. And being able to take those ideas and like what Solomon, as you described, did, think about them, consider them in light of Scripture, and see how they can be beneficial. If not, then we discard it. But if so, it could help us better, at the very least, articulate what God is saying to people who may not be familiar with the Bible or et cetera. So
there are parallels even to, the Ten Commandments. There's different, Babylonian codes that talk about stealing or murder, or does that mean that, Moses just stole those principles? No, I mean, there's a law even written on our hearts in terms of the way in which we understand good and evil in our world, and people who are made in the image of God who might not be God-fearers do have access to some of that. And we do have examples elsewhere. We have that great statement where Paul makes, at the Areopagus when he's talking about one of your own poets have said this thing, and he quotes them to the unknown God. And we do have in the book of Jude a reference to the book of Enoch, if I remember correctly, and what's we call pseudepigrapha. We do have allusions to the Apocrypha as well in the New Testament. Does that mean that the Apocrypha is Theopneustos? No, I don't think so. But still, the apostles were familiar with that literature, and when it served their purposes, they would use it and expound upon it. So.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty fascinating. But we got 11 points to get through, if we can. So
some of these things do cross-pollinate, right?
From earlier chapters. And one thing I found interesting was you talked about, don't set yourself up for someone else's debt. And you told a story about the grandma not bailing out her grandson. Yeah. And you talked about tough love. I just wanted to bring that up because the temptation, as you described, is to keep helping someone in need, bailing them out. Yeah. But after a certain point, that's not love, because they're never learning the consequences of their actions. And that woman you talked about, she would like that tough love is a very important kind of love, because you're actually not loving them when you're just constantly cleaning up for them, and they never see the error of their ways. They never change. And how are you helping them? And it's tough to even accept that, but it's a necessary thing.
Yeah, sometimes parenting and grandparenting, it's difficult to establish hard rules on stuff because, if they get kicked out of their home, are you going to give them a place to live? Just as an example, I know Christian parents that have gone both directions with that. But so here's a hard rule that I think should apply for parents, grandparents, churches, benevolence programs, whatever. Don't obligate yourself to another person's debts. Yeah. Just don't do it. Whether that person's in need or not, just here's a hard rule that's going to make life more beneficial for you, because now you're not kind of responsible for another person's diligence or lack thereof. But also you're not enabling somebody who can't get debt on their own to have that debt. So basically what you're saying is that I know this person or trust this person better than the banker or the lender does. And maybe you don't. Maybe you're biased in that regard. So that's a good hard line. And once we have that hard line established, don't obligate yourself for another person's debt, then we can talk about maybe some derivative principles that come from that in the Book of Proverbs. If you have an opportunity to be generous, be generous. Yep. Just give money. Don't loan it or, secure somebody else's loan. Just give of your generosity and pretty much just walk away from it. This is between you and God. Here's this $100 or this $1,000, or here's this bill that I want to pay for you. You don't have to pay me back. That's a better way to operate in terms of the way we do benevolence and the way that we help other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes can be difficult to find that line, but like you said, if you have that very clear rule, it really helps. It's not a loan. Because we talked about this in the past. When it's a loan, you might give more than you really can, thinking, well, I'll get it back. But if you say this is just a gift, then how much are you willing to give and not get it back? That kind of puts things in perspective. I could afford this much, not this much. So it's important. And it's so practical, and we don't always think of the scriptures having such literal practical advice, but they do. And it's worth following it.
In my first pastorate, it was really... It was very generous of the church. They gave me $10,000 as, I guess, kind of a signing bonus for me to help purchase a house. I was just coming out of seminary. We had certain debts associated with that. And they said, here's some money for you to buy a house, and then in addition to that, you'll have a salary. That was a great gift and a blessing to me to kind of get off the ground in terms of buying my first house. Now, pretty early on, like 3 or 4 years into it, Sonia and I had put away enough money where we could pay the church back. And we just wrote a check for $10,000 and said, we saved it. They didn't ask for that. They didn't want that money back. But when we did give it back, they were like, okay, now we can use that for something else. So maybe that should be the mindset of somebody who is helped. If your parents give you $10,000 for a down payment on a house or something like that, parents don't do that with strings attached. I would encourage you not to do that, or to co-sign on a house that you can't pay for. But if the kids, after, maybe some diligence and being able to kind of pay for themselves, they want to pay the parent back for that gift, go for it. But don't make that an obligation upon those kids.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. So as we move through the text, there's this fascinating verse about moving the ancient landmarks that your fathers have set. And you described how, back then, that's how they determined the boundaries with these, either a rock or some sort of, marker. Yeah. And it was a horrible thing to move it to kind of make your land bigger. Yeah. And the law condemns it. And then Solomon brings it up several times in Proverbs.
Yeah, it shows up in Pentateuch as well, several times, yeah.
So it's a very clear thing because you're basically robbing from someone. And then you made the connection today about us kind of rejecting the traditions of our forefathers and trying to kind of reinvent, in many ways, just life. And that seems to be like an ongoing thing. We talked about generations recently, and it's like each new generation has to have their own identity, their own quirk, and they never want to look back to previous generations and kind of embrace the good. And it reminds me of a thing right now. There's this trend online of what they call trad wives. Have you heard this?
I have, but I don't understand it. Maybe you can explain it to me.
I only know a little bit, but it's actually women going, it's short for traditional wife.
Oh, okay.
And they're actually going back and saying, you know what? It's actually kind of nice to be at home, raising kids, cooking for my husband. And
what a novel thought.
And it's become like a trend because it's so alien to what they've been raised to hear that it's like, yeah, this is cool. I could be a wife and a homemaker, and that's just great. And so that's a little glimmer of hope. I mean, some people do it just to be trendy, but it's like people are discovering this. Like, it's good to learn from our past.
There's a lot I could say about that, but let me go back to this passage itself. And we can derive some hermeneutical principles here. Okay. And maybe you can help us with this, Adam, as well. Because contextually, our world isn't the same as the ancient Israelites. So Joshua comes into the promised land, and they cast lots, and they apportion the land. Here's your land, this tribe, this family, etc. So you have land that has been given to you by God as a fulfillment of your promise. So I think that's the force of this command. Don't you move that boundary marker. God put it there. So for us, in our space today to say like, well, it's the same today if you move your fence posts at home. Not really. I mean, yes, but no. It's a little different because, America's not the promised land and God didn't apportion us. Yeah. I don't even have a tribe, So this is one of those moments where you got to hermeneutically think through this because, what are we going to do as New Testament Christians? Are we just going to throw this out and say, well, there's no modern day application of this, so just forget about it? We can do better than that.
Yeah.
All Scripture is God-breathed and profitable for us. So what is the kernel, the principle built into this that is applicable in our modern day world? So you can disagree with me, but the way I went with this is, this was the tradition passed down from the fathers. That's the framing of this in that chapter. And so you weren't supposed to mess with what your fathers gave you, because that was a blessing and that was something that was, apportioned by the Lord. So what are those things that God has given us, passed down from our fathers, that we need to be careful not to jettison or to just throw away or to tweak or alter? And the way I went with this is that we have certain things, positives and negatives, that have been passed down from our fathers. We need to assess them and not, just throw them aside or burn them to the ground, like so many people in our modern day world seem in a hurry to do. And let's assess, okay, what are the good things that have been given to us from church to church? Think about our Christian traditions, us in the Protestant world, in terms of sola scriptura, sola gratia, sola fide, those things, the Nicene Creed that's been passed down for centuries. Like, let's not be in a hurry to blow all that up. Even though there are some other things that we do need to assess and do need to alter or tweak, or maybe along the way, those traditions that were passed down got beyond what the Scriptures actually say, and so now we have to reassess, is this really what God has commanded that the fathers are passing down to us, or is this maybe something that we co-opted into traditions that we don't need to take seriously? So that's how I worked through it hermeneutically. Yes, so back to kind of what you were saying with trad wives.
Trad wives.
Is trad husband a thing?
That's what I was thinking about. I haven't seen that specifically.
All right, we'll search for that later.
We should come up with our own version of that.
But should we encourage within, the Christian community, the idea of women being womanly and men being manly? Yes. Should we encourage the idea of women being even domestic? The word in Greek is oikodespota, I think, like the homemaker kinds of wife. Even if a woman is working, yes, I think there's a place for that, for a woman to be the nurturer and the encourager with the children, men as well to be breadwinners. So for those traditions, I'm not in a hurry to burn that to the ground or change everything. Certainly not in a hurry to say, men and women, those categories are artificially constructed and interchangeable. You can't possibly read the Scripture faithfully and come to that conclusion.
Absolutely. And I remember thinking about this a lot after you taught on it on Sunday, and I look back on my, thinking about what the fathers have said, what are the Christians who come before us, what they did, and like you said, it's all too easy just to kind of sweep it away. And I was reflecting in my own life, growing up in a church tradition, and even going through Bible college. I have friends now who are they still follow the Lord. Not all of them do, but some of them are still with the Lord. But they've kind of looked back on that time kind of negatively, because there's legitimate things you look back on and like, I didn't like this or agree with this, but to the point where it's like, well, none of it I want to keep. And I look back on how I was raised, what I was taught, and even in college at that time, and I want to honor the things that were legitimate. And there was I think a lot of good stuff that I learned from pastors and teachers and elders and family that I want to keep. I don't want to reinvent the wheel of following God, because they were following God. They were serving God. They had a lot of mistakes and hangups and things I look at and go, well, I don't want to do that. But I want to look to them and cherish that, because a part of it is from God. Part of it's also part of my own personal life that God chose for me to grow up in. And to reject that is like to reject a part of a good thing that God was doing in my life. So I think it's something that's worth thinking about. I know we have a lot of people in our church who have come from different backgrounds, and it's really awesome to hear their testimonies. And they might be looking at their past and being like, well, I don't like this, and I was upset I grew up in this church. Okay. Recognize the stuff that wasn't any good, but but be thankful that there are some things that you learned that were really, really good and are biblical and will enrich where you are now. And so I think it's a journey. I think it's a process that we have to take and prayerfully consider as we continue to learn in the church.
Yeah. This might be a bit of a hobby horse, so if we need to nix this later, feel free to do that. But yeah, I think that's a sign of immaturity to look back on your educational experience or your upbringing and just color it by the most negative components. I see people do that with their parents sometimes, and it's like, my parents were horrible. And I know their parents, and I'm like, your parents weren't even, in the 50th percentile of bad parents out there. So we do that with our nation. People frame the American experience as, well, we were slaveholders and we took the Indians' land. Like, that's how you want to frame the American experience? Like, I mean, sure, we've got our foibles. What nation doesn't have their foibles? And
Canada.
Don't get me started on that one. Yes, they do. But I mean, let's take somebody's or some nation's worst thing, and we're going to frame everything around that.
Yeah.
That's immature, and we need to be more thoughtful in the way that we consider those things that have been passed down to us. Especially in the American context, we have been given so much in terms of freedoms and opportunities, to kind of bite the hand that feeds you by just kind of foisting all this negativity on our experience. I think that's ungrateful. I think that's unwise.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have so much to go through. I don't think we're going to hit it all, but I wanted to talk about this at least. Solomon says something that's very similar to Jesus. Don't speak in the hearing of a fool. Jesus said, don't cast pearls before swine. And we've kind of talked about this in previous podcasts about like being careful what you say. We talked about one time, don't keep trying to win someone over if they're not interested. Like, move on. Find people who want to learn.
Right.
But my question is, how do we spot a fool?
Yeah, trial and error. I don't know. And it's not an absolutized principle, because we do see examples of even Lady Wisdom projecting before a fool. Why would she do something that we're not supposed to do? But I think the principle in there as a truism is don't waste words on unreceptive people. And sometimes it is trial and error. Let's make it super practical. You commit to discipling somebody at church, or maybe to invest in an evangelism project with somebody at work or whatever. And you get into it pretty quickly and you realize this person is not into it. This person is, fighting me for everything. They're not really learning, and maybe they got whatever manipulated into this. Maybe I was part of that manipulation. I don't know. The better thing is to say, just have a conversation. I don't think this is helpful. I don't think this is a good use of time. I don't think you're receptive to what I'm saying. Let's just, end this now.
Yeah.
And I mean, that might be a hard conversation and a hard thing to discern, but I don't really know how you're going to get to that without a little bit of trial and error.
Yeah.
But you and I have been in environments where you're communicating or you're talking to somebody and it's not going anywhere, or they're not listening. Everything you say, they're either shooting down or they're just ignoring and going right to what they want to say. And I think to be a better steward of your time and your words, you're better off avoiding situations like that.
Yeah. We kind of experience that sometimes in counseling. There's someone who knows they have an issue, they want to work through it, or they want it to be better. But then, like, you meet with them several times, and it's like you're not being open to what we're saying. We have a little bit of call it homework to do in between that doesn't require a lot of time, but you should read and write. You're not doing that, and you very quickly realize, okay, you came to us, you want to grow, but you just don't want to hear what God has to say, and so you kind of lovingly say, okay, our time is done. If you want to come back, you're always welcome. But if you're not open, if you're not even receptive, then we can't keep doing this. So
that is a perfect example.
Yeah.
And totally different from the world's take on counseling sometimes, where you sit in a chair and you talk about how your mom ruined your life, and then pay your $150 and come back the next week, and there's no end in sight because that's part of the game. It's like you get to come here and vent, and we appropriate all that venting as long as you pay the bill and nothing ever gets solved.
Yeah.
Is that too negative, my take on a lot of counseling?
Some of it, some of it's like that, yeah.
Our approach isn't like that in the way that because we're actually trying to help people.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just listening to them vent about the things that they're angry about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, there's so much more we could talk about with this chapter, but any final thoughts as we kind of wrap up this session?
Let's talk about just work for a moment, verse 29, because, I guess maybe we just talked about this in a recent Theology in Action episode. The nature of working hard before men, there's an incentive built into this in verse 29 where, Solomon says, you might have an opportunity, he's a king, right? You might have an opportunity even before me to showcase what you do. Yeah. And we could read that very cynically and say, I've been a carpenter for 20 years and nobody's even noticed what I've done, or no king or no even boss at the place where I work, or I've been, doing this skill and it hasn't really developed into anything prominent. The reminder here from Colossians 3 is whatever you're doing, you do it as unto the Lord. And, let me let you in on a secret. The Lord is the King of the universe. And so you actually are working before a king. And that's the mindset that we as Christians should have in our workspaces is let's work as unto the Lord, offering up that as an act of worship and even honoring our employer in the way that we are working, because ultimately we're not working for that employer. We're working for a higher authority. And he's pleased with the efforts that we put forth and are defying the laziness and the idleness of our culture. So just a quick exhortation at the end of this. Maybe you can comment on that as well as a writer and somebody who's been working hard throughout your adult life, Adam.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely feels like one of those truisms, not a promise. Some people feel like they've toiled for years and haven't seen any kind of benefit, but it is encouragement. It is kind of inspiring that if we have a job to do and if we have something that God puts in our lap, we should be skillful, we should be diligent, and there's a benefit because we improve and we grow in that if we're persistent and consistent. And we do see, to a certain extent, that kind of benefit. We may not stand before a king in this life, but there is a benefit. Like he's speaking like we've talked about, that kind of wisdom that's kind of universal. It's a principle we see often in life. If you're skillful, if you care about your work, it's going to be recognized, because there are a lot of people who aren't like that. Their job, they just clock in, they do the bare minimum, and then they get a paycheck, but they're not going to stand before kings. They're not going to be promoted. The boss isn't like, there's a go-getter. They're just living life. And then it's going back to social media. There's these jokes about Starbucks employees constantly complaining about their job on social media, to the point where now it's just like a meme. They act like, oh, it's so hard making coffee for people. And it's like, that person's not going to go far. Even a job like that, which seems small, it could be a stepping stone to another career. But I knew someone who had to support his family. He started at Burger King sweeping floors, but he was diligent. He did it for the Lord. He did it for his family. And he eventually got to the point where they were talking to him about becoming an executive in their company, because he was diligent, and he got promoted and promoted and promoted, and they recognized this guy was a preacher. He had no experience in food, but he was diligent, and it God honored him. And he chose not to do that. He chose to pursue more ministry. But that's the kind of thing we want to see. And it might not look like that way for everyone, but it's so much more honoring, as you said, to the Lord. It's so much more enriching in our own life if we say, I want to do this well.
Yeah, it's just probably a good place to remind people that God is not a communist. So he doesn't always give the same ability to work or to make money. Even in Jesus' parable, 10-fold, 34, 100-fold. It's like the 10-fold guy can't say the 100-fold. Well, what gives? How come I didn't get the 100-fold? Yeah. God has given us everything to be used for his glory. And let me just bring it into the church planting world. I appreciate what you said there from kind of the non-church world. But I remember a church planting coach once talking to church planters who had failed. They had planted a church, and it had, not succeeded because most church plants actually don't, or a high percentage of them fail. And he was saying to them, God is pleased by your effort and by the risks that you took to go plant a church. And even though it failed, like, you can still feel confident before the Lord. You made an effort, you put forth your best, and for whatever reason, it didn't materialize. Offer that up as a sacrifice to the Lord, and then, get to work with the next endeavor, whether that means trying to plant another church or going on staff or stepping out of ministry altogether. So little statements like that are really helpful. My dad went through a layoff when he was 40 years old, and, for any man, that's an incredibly difficult thing. And to, go to somebody in a situation like that and, assuming that they did work hard and it wasn't their fault, to say, God is honored by the work that you did, and rest in that. And don't feel like this is an indictment on you or your faith, or, gird up your loins, get back in the game, and let's move forward and see what opportunities the Lord opens up. I think that's a practical way to counsel and help people through things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you once again, Pastor, for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you all for watching. Remember, this channel has all this content as well as the sermon, so check it out. See you next time.